Good afternoon. I'm Kamal Baba, a faculty member in the biology department. I'd like to welcome you all to this symposium, which is a part of our regular series on dimensions of sustainability. And today we are going to talk about climate change in New England. What can we learn from history? We have a very distinguished cast of speakers, and I want to welcome them all. And of course, want to welcome all of you. And what I wanted to do was just to thank people who make this possible. First of all, people who has provided us this endowment, Ruth and Fuad, endowment that typically supports this series. I want to thank my colleagues in the biology department, led by Rick Kessley, who always have been very enthusiastic about these series, which Reinmar and I regularly organize every semester, and we have been doing that for the last several years. And of course, many other people who provide us all these beautiful facilities in this very beautiful building, on this very beautiful afternoon, on this very nice Friday. And so thank you again, and Reinmar will explain further the purpose of today's discussion and deliberations. And Reinmar, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bauer. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm very excited to present this symposium, the 8th, I believe, in our series. We're going to be looking at the intersection of history with science, environmental science, and specifically with the science of climate change, and the different ways in which history impinges on the study of climate change and our understanding of climate change. We have three wonderful speakers, as Dr. Bauer said. The fourth, Sarah Phillips, unfortunately had to cancel just at the last minute because of a family emergency. So unfortunately, we won't get the benefit of the one professional historian amongst us. But that's fine. We have three scientists who will be working who are working in different ways with history and looking at climate change from the historical perspective. I want to just say a couple of words about the sort of theme of the symposium before we get started. Joseph Tainter was a cultural and environmental historian working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Forest Service, from the Department of Agriculture. In 2000, he wrote a much-cited essay named Problem Solving: Complexity, History, and Sustainability. In this essay, he made three basic propositions. One was that sustainability or collapse of cultures, he was studying historical cultures. Sustainability or collapse follow from success or failure of problem-solving institutions in any society. Secondly, he said that the capacity of institutions to solve problems changes over time. And the corollary of that is that the science of sustainability is inevitably a historical science. And thirdly, he claimed that one of the main problem-solving strategies of cultures throughout history has been to increase in complexity, mostly due to increasing specialization and division of labor. So this strategy, he said, Tainter said, is often been successful and in the short run, and often been detrimental in the long run. So increasing complexity has a twofold impact in the historical perspective. So Tainter was dealing with a very, very long run. He was discussing more than 1,000 years of the Roman Empire. He was discussing long-standing Mayan civilization. But even within the shorter time frame of contemporary industrial civilization and post-industrial civilization, societies have become uniquely complex. And what I would suggest is that climate change itself is both an expression of that complexity and also the result of that complexity. And it's itself, climate change is itself a phenomenon of extreme complexity, both in terms of the large scale and in terms of the variability, both spatial and temporal variability of the impacts of climate change. So therefore, studying, understanding, and confronting climate change necessarily takes on a strong historical dimension, and that's what we're going to be looking at this afternoon. We have three examples in the form of our speakers this afternoon, three examples of historical perspectives on climate change. One, the idea that conventional scientific data series on weather and climate are very short, and so we need non-conventional data sets to supplement and complement the standard scientific approach to climate change. Secondly, extreme events are still very rare. And our second speaker will be looking at the impacts and implications of one such extreme event. We have to look into history to understand something about the way we respond to extreme events because they're rare. And thirdly, in order to enter into public policy discussions, data have to be filtered through the public media. And because they don't always get filtered through public media successfully, there can be an appearance of stasis despite rapid environmental change. And our third speaker will be discussing one instance of this where data have not been successfully introduced into the public discourse. So, without more ado, I would like to present Dr. Richard Primack, Professor of Biology at Boston University. His research interests range very widely from tropical plant ecology to conservation biology, citizen science, and climate change biology. He's done field work basically all over the world, produced over 200 scientific papers. He's been president and honorary fellow of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation, and is editor-in-chief of Biological Conservation Journal, one of the primary conservation biology journals. For the past 14 years, Dr. Primack has been working on climate change in this area, in the Massachusetts and Boston area, and recently published a book, Walden Warming, Climate Change Comes to Thoreau's Woods. And I think that is what he will be talking about this afternoon. Dr. Primack.
Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me, especially my longtime colleague, Dr. Bawa, who we've had 40 years of excellent relationships with. What I'm going to talk to you today is about the research which my colleagues and I have done, my colleagues and students and I have done about the effects of climate change on the plants and animals of the Massachusetts area, eastern Massachusetts area. Sometimes when I give this presentation, I'll use the word I'll talk about my research, but this is really research that's been done by many colleagues at many universities in the Boston area. So it's really very much of a collaborative effort. And what I'm going to do is to tell you about how we started off about 16 years ago looking for any examples of the effects of climate change in the metropolitan Boston area. When we began this project about 14 years ago, there were really no examples of the effects of climate change anywhere in the eastern United States. In my textbooks in conservation biology, I was always citing examples from northern Canada or the Swiss Alps or the mountains of Costa Rica. It was always faraway places that we were citing for examples. And 14 years ago, I felt it was very important to find examples of climate change from the continental United States, from the eastern United States, in order to present to the government about the reality of climate change, because the government 14 years ago, the government of President Bush, was very skeptical of climate change. And over the last 14 years, we've seen more evidence for the effects of climate change around the United States, but the American public still remains somewhat skeptical of climate change. It still regards it as a future problem, and still does not regard it as something that we need to take strong action now. And then now with the present government coming in with this new election, we again are getting to a more skeptical government, and there's ever more need for scientists to provide evidence to the government and to the public of the reality of climate change. And it turns out, if you're looking for evidence of climate change, that the metropolitan area of Boston provides some of the strongest evidence for climate change of any area in the United States, or almost any area in the world, because of the unique resources that we have in the Boston area. Boston is unique because we have so many universities, so many scientific clubs and institutes, and such a long tradition of individual naturalists keeping records, that if one looks very carefully at all of this information from the metropolitan Boston area, that you can find overwhelming evidence for climate change just in this one area here. So what I'm going to describe to you today is a methodology which you can use to investigate climate change. And we've just scratched the surface of it. So I think all of you with your own special interests, whether it's marine biology or frogs or bacteria, whatever your interest is, there's a wealth of information in the Massachusetts area, the New England area, that you can use in your own research. Or if you have an interest in another part of the world, you can use the same approach in other parts of the world to get a historical appreciation of the impacts of climate change. So I'm going to describe to you what we've done, and I hope I can convince you of the reality of climate change in Massachusetts, but it's also kind of a call to action for all of you, that if you want, you can use this same approach in your own research. So we describe this project as a warming world. Climate change comes to New England. And if you're going to look for climate change, if you're going to do climate change research, that you can find no place better than Boston, because Boston has warmed up by so much. So if you look at the trend in Boston, you can see that Boston has warmed up by about more than 4 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 160 years. So the Boston area has warmed up by 1.5 to 2 degrees, about 2 degrees centigrade over the last 160 years. So it's warmed up more than twice as much, almost 3 times as much as the rest of the world. And it's warmed up so much because of not only global climate change, but also because of urbanization. So Boston has warmed up as much because of this combination of factors as the rest of the country and the rest of the world will increase in temperature by the end of the century. So Boston is a model system. So by looking at the effects of warming climate on the plants and animals of the Boston area that's happened already, we can get an idea of what will happen in the rest of the country by the end of this century. So it's a great model system. But in addition to a warming temperature, which is the main effect of climate change, we also have other effects of climate change happening in the Boston area. So we are getting wetter in the Boston area. So the truism of climate change is that wetter places get wetter and drier places get drier. And in the Boston area, we've been getting a wetter climate each year. We've also having sea level rising, so we also have the sea level rising quite dramatically in the Boston area. We've had about 8 inches of sea level rise in the Boston area, more than most other parts of the country or the world. So most areas in the world have had about 6 inches of sea level rise, but Boston has had about 8 inches of sea level rise over the last 100 years. And of course also the carbon dioxide levels are rising because of increasing use of fossil fuels. So carbon dioxide is not only causing the warming temperatures that we're seeing, but also the actual increase in carbon dioxide can potentially have effects on plant growth. It might stimulate some plants to grow better, which is something that we're just starting to investigate. So in our research, we actually ask 3 basic questions, which is the first question is, how has biological diversity in the Boston area been affected by this rising temperature? The second question is, why should we care about this? And as biologists, we should care about this because these warming temperatures drive a lot of species toward extinction, particularly species that live in wetlands. And then the third question that all scientists should ask, but often don't, is what are we going to do with this information? So in addition to publishing our scientific articles, I would argue that we as scientists have an obligation to inform the public and the government about the reality of what we're finding. And then particularly in the Boston area, we need to be very concerned about climate change because cities like Boston are incredibly vulnerable to rising sea levels. In the same way that Hurricane Sandy hit New York and put New York and northern New Jersey underwater, Boston itself is extremely vulnerable to climate change. And if Boston is hit by a flood of 7.5 feet, which is a very likely scenario if a major hurricane hits Boston at high tide in combination with the rising sea levels, that much of Boston will be underwater. I put this star here to indicate where Boston University is, and you can see that all of the Back Bay and the airport will be underwater in this kind of future scenario, actually not a future scenario, this scenario if another big hurricane hits Boston at high tide. I'm not sure if I can put UMass Boston there, but it would be somewhere. Is it here?
Further down.
Here?
South.
Further down? Okay, off the... But anyway, the UMass Boston campus will be underwater in the next big hurricane. So what we're looking for is the biological effects of climate change, and the main effects of climate change are on the timing of events, which we call phenology, the distribution of species, so species that are very mobile, like birds or butterflies, can move further north or higher up on mountains, and this is an indicator of the biological effects of climate change, and also on the abundance of species. So when the conditions get warmer, species that like warm conditions will become more abundant, and species that don't like warm conditions will start dying out. And the key approach toward investigating these with a historical approach is to find old records. So you have to find old records, and 14 years ago, myself and my students just went to every scientific meeting in the Boston area, and we got up at meetings and we just told people we were looking for old records. We went to libraries, we put notices in listservs and newspapers, and at one crazy time we went around and started putting up notices in libraries and supermarkets all around the Boston area looking for old records. And of all the old records that we found, by far and away the best records were those gathered by Henry David Thoreau, the author of Walden and the formulator of the concept of civil disobedience. So in the 1850s, Thoreau, this famous environmental philosopher of this area, became obsessed with knowing when plants flowered and other natural history phenomenon in the Concord area, so only in Concord. And so he walked around Concord for 4 hours a day throughout the year, recording when things were happening during the 1850s. And Thoreau wrote, "I often visited a particular plant 5 miles distant that I might know exactly when it opened." So Thoreau provides this incredible historical information which we can use to see how things have changed over time. So this is a copy of Thoreau's records, and this is an example of what you can find if you look for historical information in the Boston area. So Thoreau made these incredibly detailed tables of when plants were flowering, but we can find other records of other naturalists, but Thoreau's are the most detailed and the oldest, and of course he's very famous, so it adds kind of recognition to the work. So this is Thoreau's writing in black, and you can see that Thoreau had very messy writing, so very difficult to read his writing. It takes a while to learn it. But this is one of his tables from May of 1857. So that's my writing in blue on this table. So in May of 1857, he walked around Concord for 4 hours every day, recording when he first saw plants in flower. So this is May 14th, May 15th, and these are all the plants that he first saw in flower. So again, he has very messy handwriting, and I wrote above it in blue what I thought he was writing. And so the first thing is to decipher his handwriting, and then make a list, make a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet of all the years that he saw particular plant species first flowering on a particular day in Concord. So this was an amazing set of records, and as soon as we saw these, we knew they were amazing. And again, there are common species of plants like high-bush blueberry that are still occurring in Concord today. And so what we began doing in 2004 was to walk around Concord just like Thoreau did and make the same observations that he did. So this is the way you use historical records. You find historical records and then you combine them with modern observations of the same thing to see how things have changed, whether it's phenology, distribution, or abundance. So what we began doing 13 years ago was walking around Concord, making the same observations, often with groups of students, and seeing when plants were first flowering in Concord, just like Thoreau did. And you can get pictures like these or graphs like these. And so this is a summary of all the research which we've been doing, and each one of these dots here, the colored dots, represents the average flowering time of 32 common wildflower species that Thoreau and we saw in every year in Concord, so these were 32 species that flowered in every year, and so this is recording when they first flowered. There was another botanist that we found named Alfred Hosmer, who also made observations of first flowering time in Concord during an intermediate set of years. And on the x-axis here, we have dates from the 1850s to the present time. On the y-axis, we have dates in the spring. And what you can see here is that in Thoreau's records here, Thoreau's observations, there's a lot of variation in terms of when plants flowered, but on average, plants are flowering about May 16th, so the average flowering time of these 32 wildflower species is about May 16th. Then we have Hosmer's observations, a lot of variation, so we have early years and late years among Hosmer's years, but on average they're flowering around May 11th. And then we have our own years shown in red here on the right, and the plants are flowering around May 5th. So it's an 11-day shift in flowering time from Thoreau's time to the present time with Hosmer's dates in between. So this shows that even if you go to Concord today, and it looks very idyllic, it looks like a wonderful New England town that's preserved very well. Maybe it's the same since Thoreau's time, but in fact the plants are flowering about 10 days earlier now than in Thoreau's time, and it's really temperature which is driving this. So instead of looking at the changes over time, if you look at the effects of temperature, it's really temperature which is driving this. The plants flower very early in warm springs, and they flower very late in cold springs. And if you look at these years right here, so this is 2010 and 2012, and those were record-breaking warm springs. And in those record-breaking warm springs, the plants flowered very early. So it's really temperature which is driving the earlier flowering time, not land use change or rainfall or anything else. The other thing that I want to mention is that we published a series of articles. So every few years when we gather data and we have a little bit of a different question, we write another scientific article. But every time we write a scientific article, we also write a press release. We work with the BU press office. We pitch it to journalists. And every time it's been covered by the New York Times, National Public Radio, because it's a climate change story which has historical data linked to Henry David Thoreau and Walden Pond. So it's a very interesting story, and it's always covered. But we always make that effort to try to sell the article to journalists and to get a wider distribution of the information. We're always finding other sources of data, other sources of historical data, and we find that in the Boston area that one incredible source of information is museum records, that the Boston area has some of the best museum records in the world, some of the best natural history museums in the world. And at the Arnold Arboretum in Jamaica Plain, they have this huge arboretum, but associated with the arboretum is a very large museum of herbarium specimens. So these are specimens of plants that were in full flower, collected, flattened, pressed, dried, and then mounted on sheets. And these sheets have labels on them which record the plant number, the plant name, number of the plant that was collected from, and also the date it was collected. And so this particular specimen was collected on May 19th, 1938, from plant number 20,953, a pink azalea. And this specimen here was collected from this exact same plant, which is still alive on the grounds today. So you can match plants collected 70 or 80 years ago with the same plant alive today and see when it's in flower. And by doing this for hundreds of these museum specimens with plants living on the grounds today, you can again see that plants are now flowering about 10 days to 2 weeks earlier than in the past. And so this is again a way of reaching a new audience with the story of climate change. So people are interested in horticulture they're interested in horticulture, they now see that their plants that they're growing, their rhododendrons, their azaleas, are now flowering earlier than in the past. So it's another way of telling the story of climate change. Also, one of the things that we're very careful to do in our research is that we take enormous numbers of photographs whenever we do research. We create lots of posed pictures so that whenever we tell our story to journalists, we can give them these photographs and they're more willing to write stories about our research because we can give them these very colorful pictures to help tell their story. We've also, for our first number of years of working on climate change, we always were focusing on flowering time, but then we realized there was a lot of information out there about leaf out times. And so it turned out that Thoreau also recorded leafing out times in Concord, and we've been recording leafing out times in Concord and at botanical gardens around the region. And we found that climate change is also affecting the timing of leafing out just the way it's affecting flowering time, that plants in New England are now leafing out about 10 days to 2 weeks earlier than they did in the past. And this is actually much more interesting to ecosystems ecologists. This growing area of ecosystems ecology tries to show how plant processes affect hydrology, affect nutrient cycling, biomass accumulation, and carbon sequestration. And we're finding that because plants are leafing out earlier now than in the past, that it's affecting all these ecosystem processes. So it shows how climate change links to this other broader area of ecosystem research, and also links to remote sensing. And another resource that we have, particularly in the Boston area, is that Boston is one of the places where we have some of the largest collections of photographs in the United States and the world. And some of these collections of photographs are enormous and have relevance to climate change research. So, for example, we encountered a woman whose special hobby is collecting photographs, stereoscopic photographs, collected at historically important cemeteries on Memorial Day. So that's her special hobby. And she said that she wanted to make her collection available to us, and that in her collection she had one particular pair of stereoscopic photographs that were very unusual that she wanted to show to us. And so she showed us this photograph on the left, which was taken at Lowell Cemetery on May 30th, 1868. And by this photograph, if you think about it, at the end of May, that she said this photograph was really different, looked different from all of her other photographs. And what's different about it, of course, is that the trees don't have leaves. So a very strange phenomenon. And when we looked at the weather records for 1868, we found that 1868 was a year in which there was no frost, or a year in which there was no spring, that there were hard frosts all during the spring of that year, and that the trees either didn't leaf out or because of the cold, or they started to leaf out and the leaves were killed by freezing temperatures. So in Thoreau's time, in the mid-19th century, people were concerned about cold weather potentially stopping agriculture, but presently we're concerned that just temperatures a little bit warmer might have really negative impacts on our agriculture present. So this work on leafing out time, observations of leafing out, leads very naturally to experiments on how plants perceive the spring. And what we've been doing increasingly is doing experiments where we take dormant twigs inside during the months of January, February, and March, and we see to what extent they will leaf out in different months, and if we expose them to different photo periods and different warming treatments. So using very simple experimental methods of what controls leaf out for trees and shrubs in the spring, we can investigate some of the mechanisms that we are seeing using these historical observations and contemporary records. We're also looking for historical records of when birds arrive in the spring and when they depart in the autumn. And we find that there's an incredible abundance of records of bird migration in the Boston area, that there are so many organizations which are keeping track of bird migration. And we find that birds are responding to climate change, but not nearly as much as the plants. So they're coming a few days earlier now than in the past. They are responding to climate change, but not like the plants are. And the connecting link is really insects. When the birds arrive in the spring, they eat insects, and when the insects emerge in the spring, they're feeding on plants. And we had a lot of difficulty finding insect information. It's surprising how few people are really watching insects carefully. But eventually we came across the Massachusetts Butterfly Club, and for the last 30 years, the Massachusetts Butterfly Club has been very carefully recording when people observe butterflies in the spring. And what we find is that butterflies, in fact, are very responsive to temperature and are emerging earlier in the spring, just like plants are. So they are responding very dramatically to climate change. And so it seems that the birds might be mismatched with the insects that they're feeding on if they are responding slower to climate change. We're also finding that Massachusetts is an incredible place to study the changing abundance of plant species. That Massachusetts is the center for historical botanical research. At the end of the 19th and early 20th century, there were many surveys of the plants in parks and towns around the Boston area. And that by recensusing these old floras, you can see how the flora is changing over time. So this is something we can do in the Boston area better than in any other place in the United States. And in Concord in particular, there have been several floras done in the past. And when we started to observe when plants were flowering in Concord, to see how things have changed from Thoreau's times, we observed that there was a very large number of the wildflower species that were no longer present in Concord. And this was quite surprising because Concord is a very well-preserved landscape. But in the end, we found that about 27% of the wildflower species that Thoreau had seen were no longer present in Concord, and about another third of the wildflower species had declined dramatically in abundance. And there are many reasons why this is the case. So, for example, housing construction, roads, deer, invasive species, air pollution, but at least some of the change is also caused by climate change. The fingerprint of climate change is not only present in the changing flowering time of plants in Concord, but also the change in abundance. And we know this because the plant species lost in Concord are disproportionately the cold-loving northern species. So we can see that climate change is already causing a loss of species there. And this loss of species will continue because the climate of Massachusetts is continuing to change. So on the left we have an IPCC diagram showing how the climate of the world will be increasing in the future, and we're actually closer on track to this higher temperature change scenario here, about 3 degrees centigrade change in the temperature of the United States. But how will this affect the climate of Massachusetts? So what is predicted is that by the end of this century, that the climate of Massachusetts, which was like that when I was growing up, but is now like this. So the Massachusetts climate now is like the climate of northern New Jersey or New York used to be, but by the end of the century, the climate of Massachusetts will be like the climate of North Carolina was like about three decades ago. So it's going to be very hot and humid. And what does this mean to the plant life of Massachusetts? It means that a lot of the rare species that we have in New England are not going to be able to survive in New England because it's going to be too hot for them. But if we think about really what we should be doing as biologists, so one of the most amazing plants in the world is the Venus flytrap. And the Venus flytrap presently lives in North Carolina. But by the end of this century, the place in the United States, which is going to be one of the places in the United States which is going to be the best for the Venus flytrap, is going to be Massachusetts. And so if we really want to think about conservation in the future, we should think not only about protecting Massachusetts' rare species that are rare now in Massachusetts, but also thinking about strategies for perhaps bringing a lot of the rare and endangered species, like the Venus flytrap, from North Carolina up to Massachusetts, or at least protecting the habitat that they might eventually live in. So this is something which we need to be thinking about. Our research group has focused mostly on spring. That's mostly what I've talked about so far, but I think that there's tremendous opportunities for climate change research in other seasons. We're really focused on autumn right now in terms of climate change research, but I think there's also a lot of possibilities for climate change research in the summer, particularly during hot, dry summers like we've recently experienced, or the winter time. There's also tremendous opportunities for linking up historical climate change records with citizen science networks. So one of the great growth areas for ecology right now is creating very large, dispersed, intensive networks of citizen scientists making observations into online databases. Some of the most successful ones have been the Journey North, the National Phenology Network, and eBird. And it's possible to create these very dense networks, for example, showing when migratory butterfly species or migratory birds come into this area. And then the challenge is for ecologists like many of yourselves or climate change biologists to take these citizen science networks, to enhance them for particular purposes, and then to use them in our own research. And also in the process of using this research to inform the citizen scientists of the value of what they're doing. The other thing which I want to point out, which I think that scientists don't do enough of, and I think it's really important for us to do, is that when we're out doing our own research is to keep your eyes open. So I think if we go out, we're always, of course, looking to gather observations for our own hypotheses, our own ideas, but there's often kind of these amazing things that are waiting when you keep your eyes open. And to my mind, that one of the great phenomenon of the last few years was this incredible drought that we had over this last summer, when there was virtually no rain in July, August, and September, and extremely high temperatures. And this provided an opportunity for us to really understand what the impact of drought is in a place like New England, which normally is a fairly wet area. What is its impact on plants and animals? And so this summer, we had a chance to really find out what drought is like in many parts of the world, many parts of the United States, which are facing chronic drought as part of climate change. So for example, this summer there was a real failure of our crops. So if farmers were depending on rainfall, there was a failure of the corn crop and most of the vegetable crops. There was a premature yellowing of leaves in the forest for many trees. And then also the birds were becoming desperately hungry, for example, coming to hummingbird feeders. And also a lot of our migratory bird species just departed earlier. And there was almost a complete die-off of insects in our forests and fields over the summer. So this was an amazing natural history phenomenon that we could also observe as part of our own field work. And then the last thing that I want to close on was the fact that Thoreau was also aware of the value of linking up historical observations or historical insights with present understandings of living systems. So Thoreau, in his book Walden, said, "The earth is not a mere fragment of dead history to be studied by geologists, but living poetry like the leaves of a tree which precede the flowers and fruits." So again, this approach of combining historical records, observations of historical phenomenon with modern observations is really, I think, the key to understanding the present situation which we have of climate change. And I think that the ideas of Thoreau, which he espouses in Walden, are really relevant to this present situation which we're in. So if you read Walden very carefully, there's 3 key points. The one key point is to observe nature very carefully, to go out and spend some time every day observing nature so you can actually see the effects of climate change with your own eye. You can bring the observations to life. The second is, if we want to deal with climate change, that we need to live simply as individuals and as societies. We need to use less fossil fuels. We need to live in smaller houses. We need to keep our houses cooler in the wintertime and warmer in the summertime. We need to use smaller vehicles. But we also need to get involved. So Thoreau, by nature, was a loner. He didn't like other people very much, but he was involved in the major issues of his time, which were war and slavery. He made speeches, he wrote articles, and all of us have to do this ourselves. So we have to get involved in the political process to change the world. So in my case, I did a lot of research, but I wasn't just content to do with the research, that I tried to take these historical observations that I made and these modern observations, and not only to write scientific articles, but to try to reach the public with the message. And the final thing which I wound up doing was writing this popular book, Walden Warming, where I hope to sort of tell the American public and the government about the reality of climate change, again, using these historical records. And with that, I end, and thank you very much for your attention.
Steve Long has engaged for much of his professional life with the forests of New England. both their natural history and sustainable management. Steve served for 17 years as founding editor of Northern Woodlands magazine, which is the signature program of the Center for Northern Woodlands Education based in Vermont. In 2012, Steve published a book, More Than a Woodlot, which has been described as the indispensable primer on what every owner of a family forest ought to know. So specifically, techniques for successful forest management in New England. As a Bullard Fellow at Harvard Forest, Steve researched and wrote his recently published new book called 38, The Hurricane That Transformed New England. And in this book and in this research, Steve has examined the impacts, historical impacts of an extreme event, weather event, and also the implications for future climate change of this kind of event within New England. And so he's managed to put together historical, current, and future implications of these kinds of events in a unique way. Steve.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Reinmar. So the Boston Globe on September 22nd had this in a lead story talking about the tropical hurricane that swept Massachusetts for the first time in the history of the area. So for us today to think that a hurricane that arrived could be considered to be the first hurricane is kind of mind-boggling. And we just can't imagine how they wouldn't have had an experience of other hurricanes. But in fact, there had been a prolonged period in which there had been no hurricanes that hit not only inland New England, which is what I've focused on in my book, but coastal New England. So it had been generations between hurricanes. And so when the hurricane of 38 hit, people were totally unprepared. Hurricanes don't hit New England. This is a phenomenon of the Carolinas, the Gulf Coast, Florida. But in fact, there had been previous hurricanes, Category 2 hurricanes to hit New England. So the previous two had been so long in the past that no one alive in New England in 1938 had ever experienced one. So we have the 1635 and the 1815, all of which you can see from these tracks that they all came up over the ocean. These did not make landfall earlier. If they had made landfall earlier, like Hurricane Irene in 2011, like Sandy in the following year, then these hurricanes would have been just coastal phenomenon. But because they came up over the ocean at very rapid speeds, they were able to make their way all the way inland in New England. So we've got these three. The track specifically of 1938 was unprecedented. So we have a track that came due north. It took 24 hours to get from Jacksonville, Florida, into the heart of New England. Hurricanes normally do not travel that quickly. People who remember Irene remember that we had warning of it many days in advance, and we could track it and we could just see where it was coming. It made landfall 3 or 4 times before it arrived, and it poked along. One of the reasons that it created such flooding was that it lasted in any one place for a good long time. So places had 24 hours of rain. The 1938 hurricane came and went in 5 hours. So all of this destruction that you're going to see happened over the course of only 5 hours. So this is the track that people expected, that meteorologists expected that to take. They expected it to recurve out to sea. And this path is a very standard track that hurricanes take. In 2009, Hurricane Bill took the track that you see here. And this is a very, very prototypical track, and it happens that way because out over the Atlantic there's a semi-stationary high pressure system, the Bermuda High, around which most hurricanes will rotate. But in 1938, that Bermuda High was stationed in a much more northern position. So it was up over Nova Scotia, and so the capacity for the storm to turn to the northeast out over the ocean was taken away. It had the same sort of steering winds that you see there. It had a very low trough in the jet stream, and so they steered it north, but instead of steering it to the northeast, it went due north. So this is what New England looked like the next day. I've got a series of historical slides from that time. This is Ware, Massachusetts. Keep your eye on that building as it disappears, the underpinning. So the flooding was tremendous, and the storm surge was tremendous. The storm surge came into Providence, Rhode Island at 16 feet of water in downtown Providence. So it had everything. It had flooding, it had a storm surge. The storm surge was responsible for more than 500 deaths. 600 people all told died, but most of those were in Rhode Island and Connecticut and Long Island because of the storm surge. Entire coastal communities were swept out to sea. New England came to a standstill because there was trees down everywhere. Every town looked like what you see here. Trees on houses, trees across roads, steeples down. The number of churches that lost their steeples was tremendous. The Eastern States Exposition, the largest fair in New England, was in the process at that very week. And so that week had been a very, very rainy week at the end of a very, very rainy summer. So this storm, the 38 hurricane, came on the heels of flooding conditions that had absolutely nothing to do with the hurricane. So totally unrelated flooding in New England that was in fact receding by the morning of September 21st. So flood conditions from a totally different weather system were then compounded by 100-mile-an-hour winds. So the damage at the time was estimated to be $300 million, which adjusted to today's would be $5 billion. So this was at the end of the Depression. This is 1938. You think of all of America struggling with the Great Depression. It's the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt was the president. And so we had just one more kick in the teeth of the people who were down. So all of this damage this was before the time when it was typical for people to have homeowners insurance. So all of this damage was on the backs of these people who were already suffering. So my focus in the book and the focus of my research has been to the forests and what happened in the forests. And so 600,000 acres were flattened over 15 million acre swath. 2.6 billion board feet were on the ground. And so as a way for you to understand what 2.6 billion board feet might look like, this truckload here has 6,000 board feet on it. And that's a very standard truck that you would see anywhere around New England today. So 430,000 of these truckloads were on the ground over the course of 5 hours. So this is 5 times what was the typical annual harvest at that time. 5 times the harvest was on the ground in one afternoon. So a convoy of trucks would stretch from Boston to Seattle and back again with all of the wood that was down. Foresters spread out across New England. That's how we know how much timber was down. They did tallies of what was down. You see this root system here. I mean, you were seeing the underside of trees everywhere. Most of them were uprooted as opposed to broken off. Some more foresters out looking at forest damage. Foresters in those days wore fedoras, you can see. Instead of ball caps, we had guys with fedoras. Here's another one. So you see that root ball there, that root wad. I mean, we often think of a root ball as something we take it we go to the nursery and we buy a tree to plant, and we come home with something about that size. But a tree in the forest, or that tree after you plant it and it grows, those roots extend out, and it's more like a root plate. And so when one of those falls, it creates really quite an incredible mess. Pit and mound topography, which I'll show you. So here is an example of what that looks like. So one of the things that happened with 38 was that this was not just one big uninterrupted swath of trees down. It was basically thousands of small disturbances that happened simultaneously. So you don't really think of it as one huge cataclysmic event. Think of it as thousands of simultaneous small storms. And so we've got openings, many hundreds and thousands of openings, less than 5 acres. You might get the 20, 30, even up to 90 acres. There was documented one 90-acre hole in the woods, but most of it was in smaller patches, but just thousands of them simultaneously. So let me just go back. So the reason that it was disparate, there's 4 different reasons. One is the position vis-a-vis the track. And so here's the track of the hurricane in red, and around it is this circular rotation. And so the circular rotation is in a counterclockwise rotation. And so on the east side of the storm, the right-hand side of the storm, you've got a 50-mile-an-hour rotation that is adding to a 50-mile forward motion of the storm. And so out to the east of the storm, you have 100-mile-an-hour plus winds. To the west, it more or less cancels itself out. They cancel each other out. And so to the west, there wasn't a lot of tree damage. There was a lot of flooding, but there wasn't a lot of downed trees. So, and the southeast wind was the most damaging, because you can see from the rotation that on the right-hand side, that wind would be coming from the southeast. So the aspect in the slope of hills, the steeper the slope, the more in the crosshairs. So these are 2 different views of the same hill. The top view has a south and an east exposure. That all went down in the 38 hurricane. That's the land that my wife and I now own in Vermont. And so the back side of it below is the north side, and that was all intact. So that was in the lee of the storm. So face south, face east, you're in trouble. Size and species of trees. The tallest trees are the most vulnerable. White pine by far was the most vulnerable tree. Land use history had a lot to do with that, because we had in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire, we had former farm fields were full of trees. So we had agricultural abandonment starting in, say, the 1850s through the 1880s. A farm field that is no longer hayed, no longer pasture, fills with trees. Trees happen in New England. You do not have to plant trees. So we have in Vermont in 1938, we were in the same situation that New Hampshire had been in and Massachusetts had been in 70 years prior. So people were still farming in Vermont. And so the damage in Vermont was quite different. It was to ridges with sugar bushes and woodlots. All of that tinder on the ground made people concerned that there would be yet another disaster on top of the hurricane. People were very, very afraid of fire. And so they went about trying to get rid of all of the brush. So what they did was they would cut and pile the brush. Now you see that these guys have saws and axes. This is before chainsaws. So all of that work was done with hand saws and axes. Because this was the New Deal, there was a ready access to labor. So here's a WPA crew working on clearing timber. We had the WPA and the CCC camps. The WPA, Works Progress Administration, CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. The latter, the Corps, was young men in camps, whereas the WPA was administered at the county level. And so you have almost like a quasi-military organization, these run by the Army, the camps. So they were very interested in rebuilding the capacity to fight fire. And so what they did was got rid of brush anywhere that they considered to be particularly dangerous. They cleared it along trails. They cleared roads and trails to and from fire towers. There was 300 fire towers in New England in 1938. We no longer really think of fire as a possibility in New England, but at the time people were very, very concerned about it. So they went about their business clearing brush, and they burned it. So that was what they did. They piled it along roads. Rainy days, snowy days, they got rid of it. So they got rid of all of this brush in about a 6-month period. So that left a lot of logs to be salvaged. And if you think of New England with its dearth of public land, most of the forest that blew down was owned by individual landowners. So all of these woods, all of this timber that was on the ground was basically the woodland bank account of all of these folks. And so the Roosevelt administration was very interested in trying to help them recoup at least some of their loss. And so they created a market for this wood. So if there wasn't a market, if there wasn't an artificial market created for it, you would have had 5 years of timber on the ground, no demand for it. Nobody would have gotten a nickel for this wood. There would have been no reason to harvest it because there would have been absolutely no market. And so the New Deal, the Northeast Timber Salvage Administration, that was created within 2 months. This was very, very nimble government work, the like of which we rarely see anymore. So they created an agency to take care of this big problem within 2 months. So this map shows a number of this focuses on the area around Petersam, around Harvard Forest, and every flag, every number on that map, every dot represents a place that timber was stored. And so in the previous slide I showed you that they stored timber in ponds. They stored it in ponds, mostly the pine, because the pine would float. They stored it in ponds in order to keep it from developing rot. rot and stain. So blue stain is something that affects logs. Pine Sawyer beetles would have gotten into it. So in an attempt to keep the wood viable, they set up these various salvage storage sites. Back in that time, the mills came to the wood. It wasn't a tradition of standing sawmills. So this is what was at the time a portable mill. So a mill would be trucked in to a place where you had tremendous blowdown, and they would get started sawing. Here's another one. And a logging crew. So here's a logging crew with the technology of the time. This is called a crawler tractor, and it's pulling a scoot. And so you put the logs on the scoot, and then you've got a crew with peavies. They take it off. They're on a pond frozen in the winter. They're on Harvard Pond, and so one of the things about the 38 hurricane was that this was something, it was a very devastating event, but in fact the silver lining was that it put thousands and thousands of people to work. And so logging crews, anybody who wanted to work could find work. And so not just in the woods, not just in the sawmills, but there was so much of the infrastructure that needed to be rebuilt. So we found all sorts of work for people. So this is Harvard Pond right there in Petersham, Mass. This was the largest storage pond in New England. Kind of mind-boggling how much wood is in that pond. They put it in the ponds also because they didn't know how long they would be holding on to this wood. They figured that they might end up owning it for 4 or 5 years, and so the pond was a way to keep it in good shape. So the best way to look at this event was that it was this huge calamitous natural disturbance that was followed by the largest logging job that New England has ever seen. So we intervened tremendously to suppress fire and to salvage the timber. So it's very hard to separate out the effects. You know, what's the effect of the blowdown versus the salvage? This was hand in hand. Most of this was salvaged. So the lasting effects in Vermont, what we ended up having was basically the northern hardwood forest. It blew down, but it was replaced by the same species of trees that were underneath. A northern hardwood forest will have various age classes in it. So you'll have beech, maple, birch, and you'll also have young trees in the understory of those species. And so when the overstory, when the canopy blew down, then these younger trees underneath had the opportunity to come into being. So they took over, and then you also had farm abandonment because the sugar orchards that went down was a tremendous financial hardship for the owners, for the farmers, because they could make enough money from this crop in the spring to pay for a hired man for the whole year. So this was not just pin money. This was really important to them, and so a lot of farmers lost their sugar orchards and lost their capacity to farm. And so you see this image, these paired images are the same hillside. The one after the 38 hurricane up on top there. You see it sort of looks like a bad haircut. It's not really just totally flattened, but that's the way it looked. And then down below you've got what it looks like today. And so you notice that there's an intact forest on the top of the hill, but you also notice that there is a forest where it was field up until that time. And so we've got a lot of farm abandonment growing up into the pine that we saw was very vulnerable in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And so this is an image of Massachusetts and New Hampshire in 38. And so we've got all of these trees down, and then the effect of it over time. Richard talked about Thoreau and his observations. He wrote a paper called The Succession of Trees, and in it he talked about pine forests that would have oak seedlings growing in underneath it. And when the loggers come and they cut that pine, then those oak seedlings are ready to come in. And so what you end up with in this hurricane was the same thing as what happens in a logging job, is that the trees in and underneath are now, they have the opportunity to come in. And so what happened was this temporary placeholder forest of white pine, which is very, very different from the natural forest of the pre-settlement forest. You see that was, that the temporary forest blew down, and we get a reversion to the pre-agricultural species mix. So what happened was we accelerated forest succession in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. So this is a cross-section of a tree that was cut in my woods in 2011. And you can see the graph marks its growth. So this tree was established by 1890. So this tree was at the time of the hurricane was 48 years old. And I'm going to show you how big it was at that time. So that's the diameter of it in 1938. So it was one of the trees that survived the hurricane. So it had a diameter like that. It might have been 15, 20 feet tall. All of the trees around it blew down, and it then put on tremendous growth. And so in the succeeding decades, it grew to be a 14-inch diameter tree by 2011. So that's the way that all of the trees in the wake of the hurricane over the decades, they've recovered. And so we have woods that were devastated in 1938 and that look like this now. And you would walk in them and you would say, I can't imagine that these trees had been, that this forest had been blown down, but it was. And so along with that, we get increased vulnerability because we have more forest cover than we did in 1938. And so, and the trees are taller, and so we cover more ground with trees and they're taller. And tall trees are most vulnerable. So we have a lot more area that is vulnerable to a hurricane, to a replay of 38. So if we were to get a replay of 38 today, and there's no reason to expect that we couldn't get one at any year. It's a natural event, and it's going to happen again. Whether it happens next year or happens 100 years from now, we have no way of telling. But if we look at New England, Long Island in New England has twice as many people in it as 1938. So there's so much more infrastructure, there's so much more wealth, and so people are now estimating that the potential for damage from a hurricane of 38 magnitude would be about $40 billion. So not the $5 billion that would have corresponded with just translating the money, but you just start thinking about the increased infrastructure that we have. And so we're in for something really serious. So we've got all of this, we've got more people, we've got more infrastructure, and we've got more trees. Trees are going to blow down over power lines, they're going to blow down telephone lines, we're going to lose electricity, people are going to be stranded. And we think about what happened with Katrina, with people trying to get out of New Orleans. Well, that's going to happen around here. We'll have flooding. It'll be a very, very devastating event. And you think, okay, well, we've got our smartphones and we'll be able to keep in touch. But in fact, we won't, because that whole system requires electricity. And so without electricity, we're not going to have the capacity. So transportation, communication, the whole thing is going to be jeopardized. And it could happen, as I say, next year. It could happen in 100 years. We have been, in terms of climate change, we think of the warmer oceans. Oceans are the engine for the power of a hurricane. And so we have warmer temperatures over a larger stretch of ocean. We need that kind of temperature in ocean water in order to make the next hurricane. And so we have a tremendous opportunity for that with the warming oceans. And so with that, I'll bring it to a close, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve Long. That was a fascinating view into the past and potentially the future as well. Our next speaker is Dr. Peter Frumhoff, who has been engaged with the intersection of climate science and policy in this country for a long time, was one of the lead authors of the IPCC's fourth assessment in 2007, served as chair of Northeast Climate Impacts Assessment also in 2007, currently serves on the Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resource Science for the U.S. Department of the Interior. And Dr. Frumhoff has taught at Stanford, Tufts, University of Maryland, is an associate of Harvard University Center for Environment. But his main focus today and currently is as Director of Science and Policy at the Union of Concerned Scientists, of course, one of the organizations most involved in bringing policy bringing science into policy, science and evidence into the policy process. And Dr. Frumhoff is also chief scientist for the USC climate campaign. Okay, Dr. Frumhoff.
Thanks so much, Reinmar. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. I appreciate the invitation to participate in this symposium on this beautiful Friday afternoon. My gosh, even in December. It is a real treat to come here to UMass Boston. As Reinmar said, I want to talk about in this case, the role of evidence from both history and science that I think is relevant to the question of responsibility for climate change. I'm going to argue that the notion of responsibility is really central to the question at hand about what we do about it. I'm going to focus in particular, as the title suggests, on the climate responsibilities of fossil fuel companies and what we can learn from history and from science, both in and beyond New England. I'm a global change ecologist, kind of a recovering academic, and really like the intersection of being in a boundary organization that brings science and evidence to bear on informing and motivating decision-making. Most of my work is national, and the organizations is national and international in scope, but we're based here, actually headquartered in Harvard Square, and we do a lot of work in the Northeast and in Massachusetts. I had the privilege, as you mentioned, back in 2007 of chairing something called the Northeast Climate Impacts Assessment. Richard Primack showed a slide of these migrating climates That was an example of how we tried to take scientific information and translate it into ways in which decision makers and the public can understand in that case, the projected impacts of climate change and what it would mean for how climate feels here in Massachusetts and other Northeast states. And that work, like a lot of our work, was done in collaboration with academic colleagues, in that case a group of scientists across disciplines from about 50 colleagues from universities and other research institutions across the Northeast and nationally, and including here in UMass Boston, Ellen Douglas, and now Paul Kirshen, who's also here at UMass Boston working with us on sea level rise. And one of the things that we noted in the report that I actually didn't know until we pulled that information together was the interesting case of the Deer Island sewage treatment plant. I don't know if anybody of you have actually had a chance to go out there. If you do, it's a really fascinating location. They've done a lot of work over the years to design this with lots of elements of sustainability from various dimensions in mind. Those giant egg-shaped digesters are what bring wastewater into the plant and turn it into natural gas, which is then used for energy, and also the sludge, which is often used in large part for fertilizer. There are these wind turbines, also solar panels that get a lot of their energy from renewables. It's a really interesting design, really quite forward-looking with respect to the dimensions of, in that case, energy sustainability that were built into the design. But there's another piece of this, I don't know how many of you might know this, I certainly didn't until we wrote this report, is that when this treatment plant was massively expanded and developed in the 1980s, the designers, the planners, decided to take into account projected sea level rise. And the treatment plant was built 1.9 feet, almost 2 feet higher than it would have been otherwise, taking into account what they understood to be, and actually it's still quite within the range of reasonable projections, the projections of sea level rise over the course of the expected lifetime of the planet through roughly the middle of this century. And because that heightened height would be something that they'd also be, of course, enabled to deal with storm surges of the sort that we might see with hurricanes and other major damages today. And to my knowledge, it's the first and one of the few major investments in coastal infrastructure that explicitly takes projected sea level rise into account and invested in, obviously, greater cost in order to raise the entire sewage treatment platform almost 2 feet. So it's a really interesting example in my view. And what's striking about it was done in the 1980s. Now, you can ask, what did people know about climate change and impacts in the 1980s? Now, scientists knew about climate change, the causes primarily of rising atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the burning of fossil fuels. You know, for decades previously, policymakers knew. Roger Revelle was one of the leading scientists monitoring the rise in atmospheric concentrations, briefed President Johnson back in the 1960s. The National Research Council wrote major reports on climate change back in 1979. But this wasn't really a public issue. It wasn't really salient to decision making in a broad range of ways until 1988. 1988, as some of you may recall, some of us may recall, was the year that Jim Hansen, NASA scientist, testified before Congress, summer of 1988, that not only was climate change a concern for the future, but he showed evidence suggesting that it was happening already. And that evidence and the prominence of his testimony put climate change on the front page of the New York Times, raised the profile of the issue in a very high profile way. And the New York Times is just an example of this. And at the time, and it may be hard to think of this in the moment in which we're in terms of the very polarized public and policy discourse about this issue, but it wasn't a complicated, polarized issue then. Then Vice President George Bush, the first George Bush, running for president, talked about fighting the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. Right? It was an issue that was not divided in a partisan way at all. That happened later. I want to talk a little bit about that. So it's actually interesting, and someone should do some historical research, perhaps it's been done, I've not seen it, to try to understand what those planners with Deer Island knew, where they get their information, what was their motivation, at a very early stage in our broader understanding of climate change risks and consequences. It's a fascinating, I think, a piece of history to be written. But let's take another coastal infrastructure here in New England, well, at least upstream a little bit. This is the ExxonMobil Everett terminal, the location of it, refinery in the Mystic River. Just to give you a sense of what it looks like. That's an aerial view, I guess that's Google Maps aerial view of the terminal. And right on the edge of the Mystic River. And this past September, the Conservation Law Foundation, based here in Massachusetts, filed a lawsuit against ExxonMobil, arguing that they knew about the risks of climate change and have known about those risks and their consequences, including for sea level rise, for decades, but did not take those risks into account in their design of this terminal. And that when major storms happen, which they do, and in the context of not only the sea level rise we've seen already of 8 inches, but sea level rise projected to continue for the decades to come, that they have knowingly put the communities in Everett at risk for the kinds of damages that impacts on that terminal would cause in terms of the flow of chemicals and other pollutants into the Mystic River. So, two very different case studies, both in Boston area, with respect to preparedness and responsibility, taking responsibility for climate change impacts and damages. Now, the Conservation Law Foundation lawsuit built on, some of you may know, there's been a lot of public attention to a series of investigative reports, Inside Climate News, at Los Angeles Times, work that my organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, have done. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. To dig into, in this case from LA Times report, archives that Exxon has maintained, showing that in advance of 1988, this company, a very large company, lots of technical resources, lots of expertise. Their major product causes a very significant contribution to climate change in context of carbon dioxide emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. And in fact, those archived documents highlight that lots of scientists within Exxon, certainly well before 1988, starting in the late 1970s, were well aware of the scientific discourse about climate risks, were actively involved in collaborations on climate modeling with scientists and universities, and that in fact, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, this is from the 1990s, that Exxon, in fact, as a company, took that climate modeling into account, for example, as they looked at the impacts of sea level rise and Arctic ice reduction in their own work in the Arctic, where they do a lot of, and we're doing a lot of drilling. So they were actively using, according to these investigative reports, good climate science modeling, the best available evidence at the time, to inform their own operations. And it's that disconnect that the Conservation Law Foundation and others have highlighted with respect to their arguing, this is a proposition, that ExxonMobil should have taken responsibility for that knowledge in order to protect and make aware for citizens of the risks of their products, both generally and in the context specifically of that lawsuit with respect to the Everett terminal. So I want to just take a step back from this and kind of unpack the question or the notion of responsibility. It's really embedded fundamentally in the international policy dialogue about how we address climate change. And the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was codified in 1992, which the first President Bush signed, it talks in Article 2 about the common but differentiated responsibilities among nations. It's an international agreement, and so it focuses on national level responsibilities, that different nations have responsibilities, that's kind of very intentionally vague language about common but differentiated, suggested that all nations have a role to play, but particularly at the time, the notion was that nations who've historically contributed the greatest amount to the problem had a particular responsibility to address it, something that very much still is at play in the international climate negotiations. But responsibility can be parsed in other ways as well. Often when I talk to people about responsibility, they will say, and I certainly agree, that we all as individuals have responsibilities for addressing the problem. We make choices about how we live our lives, what size homes we live in, what kind of cars we drive, and what behavior we take to reduce our own carbon footprint, our own contribution to the problem within the extent of our access to information and funding, frankly, so people have more capacity to address the problem than others. But as I said at the beginning of this talk, I want to focus in particular on the question of the responsibilities of fossil fuel companies, the coal, oil, and natural gas companies who sit at the base of the carbon supply chain, extract coal, oil, and natural gas from the ground, and turn it into combustible products to market. I would not suggest that these companies are solely or uniquely or primarily responsible for climate change, but I do want to wrestle with the question of what responsibilities they have as actors in this space. And from my perspective, there are a couple different ways to think about their responsibilities. Certainly that's implicit in the Conservation Law Foundation lawsuit with respect to Exxon. What first got me thinking about this was a body of scientific work that was done by a colleague of mine, Rick Heady, who published a paper in 2014 in the journal Climatic Change. What he did, kind of working on his own for several years in a very, very idiosyncratic, focused way, not working for any major organization or at an academic center based in, working out of Aspen, Colorado, Snowmass, Colorado. He basically went through all kinds of dusty library archives around the world and various other resources, Securities and Exchange Commission reports and other documents, and calculated the amount of coal, oil, and natural gas that the largest fossil fuel companies had extracted on an annual basis, dating back to the middle of the 19th century, basically the start of the Industrial Revolution. It's an amazing amount of meticulous, painstaking work that boggles. I could certainly never do it. But he did it over a period of several years and translated those calculations into the carbon dioxide and methane that was released each year from the combustions of the products that individual companies produced. Go into the methods if you'd like, but here's the bottom line. What he found, so the blue curve shows, again, since the middle of the 19th century to roughly the present, to 2010, that's the total anthropogenic, human-caused rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide and methane each year released to the atmosphere from all emission sources, global emissions. The red is the same, but just from the top 90 companies. And so it's really the area under the curve that matters. What he found was that roughly 2/3 of all of the carbon pollution that's been sent to the atmosphere can be traced back to the products of just 90 companies. A very small number of companies have had a disproportionate large impact in terms of the combustion of their products. That's one, to my mind, that's one element of the question that companies have had an outsized role. In fact, half of those emissions have taken place. You can see how the curve rises dramatically. Half of those emissions have taken place since 1988. Right? Roughly half, actually now more than half, of all fossil fuel-based carbon emissions have taken place since we've known broadly, in a public sense, of the risks of these products. But I would argue that it's not just the quantitative contribution to the problem that is an indication. After all, people bought this stuff, right? They're just the producers. But it's also the question of what they did, going back to the CLF lawsuit, with the evidence of the risks of their products. So how did companies respond to the evidence? Obviously, some companies may have known well in advance, as the case against Exxon suggests, but certainly everybody knew, by and large, certainly these companies knew by 1988, by the time it was on the front page of the New York Times. So there's a lot of evidence, I won't go through all the details of this now, that the major fossil fuel companies, certainly US-based investor-owned companies and European-based investor-owned companies, invested in a significant amount of disinformation. They formed something called the Global Climate Coalition in 1989, the year after the Hansen piece made it on the front page of the New York Times. And they spent many millions of dollars investing in sowing doubt about climate risks. A lot of this is documented in a variety of sources, many scholarly sources. That UCS happened to produce a report 2 years ago called Climate Deception Dossiers that looks at all the FOIA, that is to say access through Freedom of Information Act and other resources, documents that are available that highlight the kinds of things that companies did. I just want to show you one example illustratively. I don't know if you can see this. This is an internal communications memo produced by the American Petroleum Institute in 1998. 1998 was right after the second assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was released, highlighting increasing confidence in the evidence of climate change formally from the scientific community. It was at the same time that there were debates, certainly active debates in the United States, about whether and how to move forward with the Kyoto Protocol, which was the precursor essentially to the Paris Agreement that was signed and entered into force this past year. So this is an internal memo from the American Petroleum Institute's climate communications planning that they were developing at that time. And the memo, just to read you some points of it, says victory will be achieved when, just the highlighted section, average citizens understand or recognize uncertainties in climate science. That recognition of uncertainties becomes part of the conventional wisdom. Just jumping to the bottom of this, I won't read it all, but those promoting the Kyoto Treaty on the basis of extant science appear to be out of touch with reality. This is a politically focused communications memo that was underlying a very well-financed campaign on the part of a group of fossil fuel companies engaging with active communication strategists to sow doubt about climate risks in order to advance a policy goal, which is to avoid regulation of their products. Again, happy to walk through lots of other examples of this. I also want to point out that it didn't have to be this way. We'd be in a very different place now had companies accepted the risk of their products and recognized that kind of sensible regulation might have reduced these risks for current and future generations. And there was some discussion in the fossil industry at the time. John Brown, later Lord Brown, who was the CEO of British Petroleum, made a remarkable speech in 1997, same time period, at Stanford, in which I won't go through the whole speech, but he basically said, there's now an effective consensus among the world's leading scientists, this is the IPCC report at the time, that there's a discernible human influence on the climate, and he said, we have a responsibility to act, and BP accepts that responsibility. Can't do it at all, but we have a responsibility to act. And he then moved BP into, they rebranded themselves, some of you may recall, as Beyond Petroleum, and began investing in renewable energy and doing all kinds of work to reduce the carbon impacts of their products. It was short-lived. Other companies, they pulled out of the Global Climate Coalition, stopped investing in those campaigns, but other companies did not, Exxon included, and the fact is that we rejected the Kyoto Protocol, and BP was basically making a bet on carbon regulation, which didn't come at the time, and they then went back, post-John Brown, to their consistent pathway with other fossil fuel companies. So there's lots of ways in which companies can characterize what they're doing. Chevron has had a major campaign to advertise its support for renewable energy. This is a fairly recent campaign, even as they've reduced their funding and investments in low carbon energy. And we're certainly in a different place today now than we were back in the 1990s. Most companies, by and large, explicitly recognize climate risks, talk about them and accept them. Even Exxon This is from their website. Rising greenhouse gas emissions pose significant risks to society and ecosystem. This is current. This is pretty good. Hard to argue with this. Straightforward recognition of the risks of climate change, but one has to look not only at what companies say, but at what they invest in. So companies belong to a range of trade associations and lobbying groups and invest in their efforts to lobby for various outcomes. Just to give you an example, these are trade associations and lobbying groups that are quite prominent within the U.S. The American Legislative Exchange Council is well known for doing briefings of state legislators on climate change and other topics. They usually bring them together after they've been elected at state levels and give them briefings on climate science or I would say misrepresentations of climate science in order to inform and encourage them to repeal state-based climate and energy policies. This is what ALEC puts on their website. Climate change is a historical phenomenon, and the debate will continue on the significance of natural and anthropogenic contributions. This is what Stephen Colbert would call truthy. There's some element of truth to this, but it's because there always will be a debate about the relative contribution of different sources, but it's undermining and underrepresenting in a significant way the risks. And ALEC and other companies actively oppose trade associations' regulations on products. I would argue this is a continued kind of misinformation investments on the part of some fossil fuel companies. And then companies also project, they think of their own business model, what the future of carbon emissions from fossil fuels will be. So now coming from history to future. So I just want to quickly show you this. We've been on a pathway, as Richard highlighted, of rising emissions. We're projected in a business as usual way to continue on a pathway of rising emissions that will bring our temperatures well above the 2-degree target that was agreed to in Paris. This is from the International Energy Association. If you want to move on to a pathway consistent with a 2-degree target, emissions need to stabilize and then decline fairly rapidly in order to keep our carbon emissions below and the temperature consequences of our emissions below 2 degrees. But companies make their own projections for their own business purposes of what the future of emissions from the burning of fossil fuels will be. I'll just show you a couple of them. This is BP and Shell. They produce several scenarios. That's through 2035. Exxon is slightly lower. They all project that emissions will continue at a pace that will bring us onto a 3 to 4 degree world. And I would argue they may all well be right, certainly possible, but I'd also argue that they're not independent actors in this process. They're not independent observers of what we'll see next, that their own business plans and political strategies are consistent with trying to bring these outcomes about. And I just want to show you a quote from a talk that Rex Tillerson is the CEO of ExxonMobil and currently being considered for the next U.S. Secretary of State on the short list. At his shareholder meeting, Exxon shareholder meeting in 2015, he was asked about those projections and how, shouldn't we have a plan B if climate change is really serious and we need to reduce our emissions? And he responded in this way, basically by saying that the science is too uncertain for us to go in that direction. We don't know what the difference in the climate effects of a 600 part per million, that's carbon dioxide concentrations, versus a 450, that's the 2 degree concentrations, will be. The models just aren't that good. Solutions will present themselves as the realities become clear, either through improved modeling and hard confidence in predictive models, or whatever this means, as they are evidence to us. And they have not taken actions, despite their acknowledgement of climate risks, as I showed on their website, to lay out a plan or a pathway or a projection for how they might transition into a company that produces energy consistent with 2-degree carbon emissions pathway. So I would argue that they're not acting responsibly in this context. Whether they're acting illegally or not is another question altogether. But I do think it enables us to ask the question about what we should expect as a society, as scientists, as citizens. What should we expect, responsible companies to do? What would a responsible fossil fuel company look like? So I want to suggest some elements. One is they should stop supporting disinformation. Seems pretty straightforward to me, both directly by their own companies and through the trade associations and lobbying groups with whom they belong. They should unequivocally support sensible limits on greenhouse gas emissions, consistent with the evidence that they're now acknowledging. They should look for ways to align their business models with a carbon-constrained world, to lay out projections for how they may transition to a low-carbon energy pathway. What would that look like? What kinds of investments would it be? Would it be in carbon capture and storage or in biofuels? What would be the pathway for companies to take? None of them really do this. They should disclose to shareholders the potential risks of damages from climate change to their facilities, including the Everett terminal that I just showed you, which obviously have an impact on company performance. And again, consistent with this lawsuit, I would suggest they should pay a fair share of the costs of the damages of climate change and the adaptation costs for preparing for the impacts that their products have, despite their knowledge, caused. I'm mindful of the time. I want to just quickly conclude with some forward-looking work about how we can, as a society, look to hold companies accountable. This is obviously a conversation that we're having in a variety of different ways on college campuses with respect to divestment, with shareholders, in many cases actively seeking to move companies as shareholders of company stock, legally through not only the Conservation Law Foundation piece I mentioned, but some of you may know here in Massachusetts, Maura Healey is investigating Exxon, getting a little pushback on that front, and New York Attorney General is also taking action. There's a lot of interesting things at Mix about efforts to hold companies accountable. UCS, we produced a report this past October that tried to look systematically at how companies rank, how they might be scored or graded across those different kinds of responsibility criteria, not to necessarily put them all into one soup of bad actors or better actors, but to say, well, how are they doing? And how can we as a society expect them or encourage them or motivate them or require them to do better over time? We looked at several companies, both oil and gas companies and some coal companies, just to kind of get this going. We looked at a variety of criteria. This is how companies, again, I won't go into the details of this, but how they scored, how we scored them across their consistency and accuracy of their public statements on climate science. You can see here that we scored Exxon as egregious. Other companies did better. Shell, in this case, was at the top of our ranking and had an advanced score. We looked at other criteria too. Again, I don't have time to go into this, but their affiliation with trade associations and lobbying groups. Not just what they do, but what those who they invest in and support and who lobby on their behalf do. And most of them didn't do so well against our criteria. Others could look at those criteria and perhaps come to different conclusions. We're trying to be very transparent about this as an effort to provide evidence of accountability and responsibility. I want to say that companies are responsive or can be responsive. That it's not fixed. These are big organizations, but one can encourage them to take responsibility. I'm very pleased to say that last year, 2015, two major oil and gas companies, BP and Royal Dutch Shell, both European companies, which may be part of the reason we could discuss, decided to leave the American Legislative Exchange Council. I and my colleagues at UCS and others had lots of conversations with them about the disconnect between their own statements about the risks of climate change and their understanding of those risks and their willingness to talk about the need to address them and their support for a lobbying group that was so inconsistent with that. We did that both in a very high-level way with individual company leaders, and we also engaged with social media campaign. This was a little thing we did on Twitter to remind Shell that their actions had an impact on their social license. That companies don't only operate with a legal license, but a social license to operate, and it's important for people to recognize that if you're acting in ways that are inconsistent with the risks of the products which you acknowledge, in this case by funding ALEC, people should know about it and should care about it, and it's generated hundreds of thousands of tweets to Shell, and they pay attention to these kinds of things. This does matter in the day in which we're in. And so companies do operate with social licenses. Some of them can be influenced in positive ways to take good action. I feel good about that. Just yesterday, maybe the day before, Barnard College just produced a report that had been in the works for some time as a recommendation from a commission that was set up to advise the leadership of Barnard at Columbia on whether and how to divest their portfolio from fossil fuels. And they actually turned to, I was pleased to say, they turned to the scorecard, the accountability scorecard we produced, and said, well, let's not do a broadside divestment. Let's be strategic about it. And drawing on that kind of information, they made a recommendation just yesterday, the day before, that they should divest from fossil fuel companies that deny climate science or otherwise seek to thwart efforts to mitigate the impact of climate change, and to use these kinds of independent rankings as fodder for making wise investment decisions. So I'm very pleased that we can begin to have, I hope, a more nuanced conversations. It's complicated in the particular political moment we're in to think about responsibility and encouraging companies to take responsibility for their action. I do think that it's in the context of a symposium on sustainability, as it relates to climate, not only here in New England, but nationally and internationally, that companies play such an outsized role, fossil fuel companies, on whether and how fast we transition to sustainability with respect to our carbon emissions, that their political influence is very large. And as a society, through a variety of mechanisms, we need to hold them responsible for aligning their actions with evidence and a societal notion of what being responsible looks like. I'll just leave you with this cartoon from The New Yorker. And you can see it says, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we create a lot of value for shareholders. That's not where we're hoping to go, but it is a reminder of where we might go if we don't take concerted, do the action end of Thoreau's three different points from his Walden book. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
The panel discussion will largely consist of questions from all of you. I'll begin with a question for you, Peter. You mentioned that, of course, the corporations are not behaving uniformly. But I wanted to come to one particular set of corporations, and one is, you talked about the fossil fuel companies. And then the automobile industry. I did think that happening somewhat differently there, in terms of what they are preparing for, what type of future they are preparing for. And what are your comments on sort of differences in approaches from the automobile industry and the fossil fuel?
Well, I entirely agree. At least over the past decade, the auto industry has, by and large, invested in and been open to accepting, by and large, policies that increase fuel economy standards, for example, and therefore having a level playing field by which they might compete with producing cars that have lower impacts with respect to their emissions. That happened in large part because of the industry bailout after the 2008 recession, where the government at the time, the Obama administration, had a lot of leverage over them to move in that direction. Before that, to be honest, many of the U.S. auto manufacturers were in pretty much lockstep with some of the fossil fuel companies in terms of their political opposition. But that changed, and I think that's a reflection that under changing political circumstances, economic circumstances, things can change. But they also change back. We now have low gas prices. We have an administration coming in which may loosen those restrictions on fuel economy or seek not to increase them. So I think the jury is out with respect to whether and how fossil fuel or how automobile companies act in this moment. Of course, companies like all of these are global actors, are not just focused on the U.S., and policies in Europe and in China and elsewhere are also driving change.
I was wondering if you'd comment just a little bit more maybe about the current strategy to either target the public perception of climate change and the importance of it, or sort of federal policy or governmental policy in a world in which it seems like the public is ready to believe anything they read absolutely that just comes out, and in a world in which Truett will probably be the new EPA manager and the CEO of a major oil company is potentially the new Secretary of State. What do you think is maybe the most effective strategy in order to foment change, both in public and private or community efforts?
I think all of us could probably respond from our own individual perspectives. Look, I think I don't think it's a lack of information that leads people to reject evidence. I think it's an alignment of their values with sources of information from which they get. We live in a world in which people get information from very narrow channels, increasingly narrow channels, often that align with their own worldviews. I think as scientists we have an obligation and a responsibility to let people know what the facts are and to remind them of that in effective ways that connect to their values about what they're concerned about, their kids and their jobs and their health, and to stay within the bounds of what science can tell us, and to do so forcefully and clearly and firmly. And I think that looking for ways in this particular moment to reach out to people who are in other echo chambers, right? I just as one very simple example, there's a lot of renewable energy in very red states. Right? Wind in Texas, solar energy in Arizona. It's economically very attractive. It's moving forward very rapidly, much more so than in the Northeast. And there are a lot of people who are very conservative who really like clean energy, and particularly like it from an economic perspective and from an energy choice perspective. They want to be able to decide if they want to have solar photovoltaics on their roof and not have the utility only sell them what they want. These may not be people who get or care or are interested in climate change as a topic, but they are interested in energy, and clean energy in particular. So I think there are ways to engage in dialogue and find points of contact and common interest that lead us all into a positive direction without tripping over the variety of polarized filters with which we bring to an issue. I think it's going to be very difficult, especially in the moment we're in, to quote unquote convince people to believe something that we know to be true, I know to be true, if their self-interest or their perceived self-interest or their neighbors and their community don't want to go there.
Steve, do you want to add?
Well, I don't really have much to add to that. I do think that it's the responsibility of journalists to do the work and try to get it right, and it's important for the public relations people to get the information out. So Richard suggesting, how much effect he's had with getting the New York Times interested in his material. Journalists are interested in a good story if it's presented in a way that is attractive and that there's a hook there. Then, climate change is not a sexy issue. It's huge. But we've got to figure out ways to make it a sexy issue.
Richard?
Well, what I would say is that the latest surveys are showing that the American public recognizes that the world is getting warmer. They recognize that global warming is happening, and they even recognize that people are largely responsible for it. That's what the latest surveys are showing. But the political process doesn't seem to be very engaged in it. During the latest presidential debate, I mean, it was very striking that the candidates really weren't talking about climate change. So you have this disconnect between the people recognizing that climate change is happening and want to do something about it, but the political process seems to be kind of bogged down in terms of doing something about it. So I think that's the challenge, is figuring out how do we take this problem and actually create some action for it. And a lot of the real discussion of this seems to be taking place at the local level, like at the towns and the state level. And I think that maybe that's where we have to put our energy until the national debate's really ready for it.
Yeah. Is there like a counter equivalent of ALEC who's meeting with legislators to present the better side?
The Union of Concerned Scientists certainly meets with policymakers. No one really is doing it on that kind of unbelievably well-funded major level at a national level across all states. But where there are states that are engaged in debates over renewable energy or other specific policy issues, I agree a lot is happening and needs to happen at a local level. Obviously what we see in some states, including Massachusetts and California and elsewhere, are very forward-looking, I would argue. And other states are kind of somewhere in the middle. Some states aren't acting at all. But the kind of outreach, is really what this is certainly something that UCS does. But there are, when there are very conservative state officials, I guess I'll just put it this way, it's very difficult for an organization which is not seen as very conservative to engage with them, right? So an organization like ALEC has lots of access to conservative folks that are often decision makers at a state level because state governments are so dominant right now in that way. I don't want to get too much into a political context. I just want to say one other thing, if I could quickly, which is that, to Richard's point, it's also possible to engage with local officials about things they care about, like coastal flooding, right? Coastal flooding is an issue which is happening across many coastal parts of the U.S., and we and others have worked with local officials, mayors and city planners across the political divide who are concerned about coastal flooding. Again, just like with energy, they're not necessarily thinking about sea level rise, but coastal flooding is being made worse. And if you start with where people are, you can begin to make inroads and to help them think about adaptation and so on to issues that are affecting what their communities are concerned about.
But on that, it seems to me that one of the really interesting things about the 1938 experience was that the recovery in New England was so dependent on the presence of the CCE, the WPA, and also the whole administrative, infrastructure that made it possible for those agencies to exist, and that was able to switch on, all sorts of recovery sort of processes that otherwise would have been really difficult. Now we're in a situation where I don't think we have any of that kind of governmental, strength available, or at least not like from one week to the next, one day to the next. I'm wondering, whether that's true or whether it's an illusion. I mean, if we compare responses to Katrina or to Sandy or any of the other, comparable events, what do we see? Do we see a government that's ready in the way that it was coincidentally in 1938?
I don't think that that we have a government that is as nimble as it was and that had a mandate to act. I mean, we had the New Deal was dealing with a tremendous, the Depression was something that did not go away easily, and they spent years and years working on these programs. Because they had these organizations in place, the WPA and the CCC, they were able to mobilize them quickly. But they also, they created a new government agency within 2 months. That is just administratively something that is a very, very complex thing to do. I mean, they found the funding sources, they found, because the Forest Service did not have the capacity to borrow money, and they needed a tremendous amount of money to do this. And so they just worked miracles, interagency miracles to make this happen. And so the government itself and then politically, I think that people were ready to have the government step in. You know, we had, this was a period in which we counted on the government to be a positive force in our lives, and we've become skeptical about that, or at least a certain percentage of the population has become skeptical about that. So it's a challenge right now, administratively, to Katrina. Katrina, you know, we saw what happened in New Orleans, but also out beyond New Orleans, you know, none of the kind of activities that took place after '38 happened out in the rural areas that were devastated by it. So FEMA, it was there to help people with housing, but you know, I mean, we can debate whether this was a good idea or not to do the tremendous salvage operation that we did, and I think there's a good case to be made that, you know, it was overblown, but then you get to Katrina and Rita, which both hit the same area, and there was nothing in place to help people through that. And so people who had these woodland bank accounts were out of luck following that storm.
I found very fascinating that you were able, for Steve, you were able to get all this data and information about the changes in the forest. I was wondering, is there any such records of data for other aspects of biodiversity, I don't know, animals or so, that you can mention or talk about?
Related specifically to
the hurricane, yeah, to the...
there was one very interesting study, and this sort of follows up on the point I was just trying to make of whether this was in fact a very good idea to do. It was a study that was made of the water flow in the rivers that were that were affected by it, and so rivers coming out of areas where there had been tremendous blowdown and salvage operations ran high the following year because those forests were not able to absorb water the way they normally were. But that condition lasted for 5 years. And so 5 years of high water flows in the Merrimack River, for instance, followed the hurricane. So I guess I'm not certain of other biodiversity data. There's been Harvard Forest did a study that where because so much was salvaged, and they did a study on what would happen if you had a hurricane and you did not salvage. And so they did this pull down. They made their own 2-acre hurricane plot at Harvard Forest, and they've studied that for the last 30 years. And basically what they've discovered is that ecological processes in those forests, while they look entirely different, the forest looks entirely different. The canopy that was 100 feet tall is now down at 10 feet. But the environment, the ecological processes were still very much intact and in place. And the species mix did not change very much because those trees held the ground. And so when we think about invasive species and the opportunity that they would have to come into, so say we had a huge hurricane followed by salvage, the opportunity for invasive species to come into those areas is tremendous. And if we clear a seedbed for them and give them all the light they want, we'll have an entirely new forest.
Yeah, one last question there before we wrap it up.
Peter, in your presentation, you had mentioned the Saudi Aramco company.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, in their what they have had for efforts in sustainability and kind of where they would rank when you were talking about the accountability scorecard.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. You know, we looked at investor-owned companies for that work. Saudi Aramco is actually primarily a state-owned company, although it does have some other investors in it. We didn't include it in it. Their focus, to my knowledge, is not on as it affects policy in Europe or the U.S. Obviously, Saudi Aramco and the Saudi government have a lot of influence over the amount of oil that gets produced and therefore the price of oil. But I don't have any data to offer. I don't know anything about exactly what they do on the issues we looked at in the scorecard.
So I just want to end this thing up by maintaining the primacy of science with a question for Richard. You alluded to lack of information on biotic interactions when we were talking about insects. And I wonder, why is that so? Because one would imagine that climate change is impacting decoupling of huge variety of biotic interactions we have, which in turn maintain the functional entity of the ecosystems. Although there are some examples, but not as many as one would expect. And I was wondering if you would comment on that.
Well, I think the problem is what people are interested in. I mean, people are interested in some things and not in others. And it's very striking that if you look at the American public, that there's huge numbers of people that are interested in birds. And people interested in birds tend to have a very high level of competency in terms of their ability to identify birds and know about individual bird species, like particularly in the Boston area, centered around the Nut Hall Ornithological Club and the Brookline Birding Club and many other birding clubs. And they get huge amounts of information. And you go out with birders and they really accurately identify the birds. And among botanists, there's a certain community of people associated with the New England Botanical Club who really know the plants very well. But among the general public, it's so amazing to me that when I go out with people, they'll start telling me about some plant that they've seen and their observations, and it turns out they've completely misidentified the plant. They think they know something about plants, but they often typically know nothing. So the knowledge of plants is surprisingly low. But there's very few people that even are interested at all in insects. There's very few people that even know the most common insects, and that knowledge is even getting lower. When I go out with my undergraduate classes these days, I actually have students that actually don't even know what a bumblebee is. So not only they don't know which bumblebee species, but they don't even know what a bumblebee is. So the problem is that there's so few people that actually know the insects, and they're actually recording when they are. So there's this small contingent of people associated with the Massachusetts Butterfly Club, but you don't have the public knowledge of this. So when you start to actually do research on this as a scientist, and you're looking for citizen scientists to work with, there just aren't the people that know the insects and are recording the data. That's the problem, that there's no one out there doing it. In contrast, there's so many people working on birds that there's just too much bird data to actually work with.
Thank you. Do you want to end with that negative comment? And I won't. So I want to thank again our three speakers and the audience. And I thought there was going to be, there are some refreshments which miraculously and surprisingly have reappeared. So you will have opportunity to talk with all the three speakers again for the next several minutes. And thank you again very, very much. We very much appreciate your coming here and spending this afternoon with us. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you.